Welcome to this ACAMS podcast. My name is John Byrne, the Executive Vice President of ACAMS, and for 2013, we're trying something a little bit different. We might be a little bit late to the party, but we think podcasting might give us additional benefits for our membership. So today, we're going to start this off with an interview with somebody I think many of you know, and that's Dennis Flermel. Dennis, of course, was the first head of the FBI's TFOS back prior to and through 9/11. Dennis, since that time, has been running his own company, and we're going to talk to him today about some of the challenges he sees now in the private sector and what he thinks about the changes that have occurred in terrorist financing prevention in the past 10 years. Dennis, thanks for joining us today. You and I just got back from a lunch with Jim Cox from the Fairfax County Police, and we're talking to Jim today about doing a program in 2013 to show the importance of working with the local police, for bankers to work with local police in terms of reporting money laundering and activity. So as a concept, I think that's a good starting off point. You've been able in your career to show the value of working closely with law enforcement and the banks. But what I'd like to start with is when you first interacted with the financial community, what were the initial challenges? Going back before 9/11, when you really started to interact. Let's not talk about bank robberies. That's pretty obvious. Let's talk about fraud and financial crime. What were the biggest challenges to reaching out to banks at that time?
Well, I think some of the biggest challenges we had was understanding each other's perspectives and the fact that we didn't have a 9/11. There seemed to be more impediments that we had to deal with and get around. And I was always a proponent of cooperation, and I think part of the problem we had initially was perhaps the level of trust that we needed between the law enforcement side and the banking side, and really coming back to understanding each other's perspective. It was really difficult, and for my part, I was guilty because I really didn't stop to think about the banker's side of things and what was important to them and what kept them up at night. I was concerned about my subjects and seeing that our fraud cases were prosecuted, and to that end, we wanted to serve subpoenas and get the records and things, and we never stopped to understand what the bankers needed. And it wasn't until 9/11, well, certainly before 9/11, we always worked at cooperating and sharing information, but I didn't understand how important that information sharing was until 9/11, and I recognized at 9/11 that the bankers were my best friends, that I needed them more and more than I ever thought I realized before, and it was critically important to get their perspective. And that was the first time I took a step back and truly started to understand the banker's perspective. And we put that into our methodologies for investigative purposes, and especially knowing that the banks are the repository for the information and the financial intelligence. And I think we kind of started to transition more toward the importance of financial intelligence as such, and as a tool to be able to trace back to terrorists and to link people together.
Whenever you talk about these things, it seems there's been ebb and flows. I've been in the industry for almost 30 years, and in the early parts of this dynamic between law enforcement and bankers, there were many bankers who certainly from the very beginning understood the importance of working together. But frankly, there was a number of bank presidents, senior managers, that said, we're not law enforcement. We shouldn't have to do all these things. And take 9/11 out of the equation for a minute. Part of it, too, was the technology challenge, because when you were first starting to reach out to banks, everything's paper, subpoenas in paper, responses that way. The technology changed now. It's hard for people maybe that are jumping into this industry, this community now, to understand how labor-intensive it had to be in the past. So my educated guess is that in some instances the bankers were reluctant to give all those resources to law enforcement investigation because they knew all the time it would take to put together the case, to look through files. But a lot of that has changed because of the technology, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's such a great point, John. you can go back. I recall back in those days, if we would serve a grand jury subpoena, the bank had 30 days, 45 days to return the subpoena, and that's where some of the rub was, to the point you made about how resource intensive that could be. And then on our side, we had the same intensity and challenge for resources, because we had to do everything by hand, and all of our reviews and analysis was driven by the review of the hard copy records, and so it was very voluminous. So in part, if I got records 30 days after I requested them, it would take me another 30 to 60 days to analyze them, and so you're 90 to 120 days in before you even begin to see any tangible results, whereas today with technology, you're talking minutes instead of days and hours with the advances, and especially with what law enforcement is doing with suspicious activity reports and the ability to analyze SARS the way they can. There's a tremendous difference, and the fact that today the records are being provided to law enforcement, or law enforcement's able to convert records into databases and then manipulate the databases for analysis. So it's an incredible difference today as to what it was years ago.
So, I mean, you and I can, and I think I probably will, have some future programs where we'll really walk back in time, because I think there's value in understanding where we came from. But we certainly could spend a lot of our time talking to maybe people that are listening today that are thinking, paper forms, we don't even know what those are anymore. But you mentioned suspicious activity reports. Those now have to be filed electronically. FinCEN's made that adjustment. So let's jump to 2013 from this perspective. And there's a lot more we can cover, and will eventually, because I'd like to go through some of the history of the movement of money laundering and financial crime into the intersection that we believe it is today. But now that you're in the private sector, as it were, you spent all those years in your career in law enforcement working with the banks, sometimes against the banks. Now you represent institutions. You go in and do some training. We're all, I say we, the AML community, is all trying to figure out new technologies, new methods of moving money, the global nature of all of this. What's the biggest challenge today? Is it still as basic as good communication, good relationships? I mean, even after all the technology changes, does it still come down to who you know and how you can work with those people? What do you see now when you get called in on a case? Not so much what's totally different than before, but what are the challenges in 2013 for an AML professional?
Well, I think it still goes back in large part to relationships and to the ability to communicate and share information as much as we can, especially today when the mechanisms are in place to better use shared information. So I think that's important, but a lot of it comes down to understanding and trust. And when you've had relationships that have been built up, you're able to go to those people and to work better with those particular institutions or those different segments of an institution. So I think that the trust factor and certainly the personal relationships that are built up and the ability to get out and form those relationships through liaison and networking is so critically important. And then the ability to use the technology. I think it's challenging as we move on. Everybody's reluctant to accept change. I know, in my agency, I embraced the change. I embraced the new technology, but I saw everybody around me who had a hard time accepting that and looking for to make those changes because people were in a comfort zone, and it's very difficult. And so from the standpoint of challenge, technology has changed things so quickly. How comfortable are we as individuals with our human nature accepting change, and I think that plays a role in this whole dynamic too.
Yeah, I mean the comfort level, that's so important. I think we see our children and their children obviously will just have a frame of reference that's so different from ours, and that's not so much an age comment as it's the technology is moving so quickly. Yeah. So our theme is obviously today the partnership, and obviously I'd like to think too that one of the missions of ACAMS has been, certainly since I've been here, is the connect points between private and public sector. And as you point out, the information sharing, the relationships are so important. Again, one of the reasons we were meeting today with Jim from Fairfax County, he wants to, selfishly in a good way, wants to reach out to the banking community and say, hey, we're here on the local level. You can come to us with cases that you're interested in. We selfishly want the bankers to know that there is a contact point and make those connections. So historically, the reason for relationships would typically be because a bank had hired someone who was retired from law enforcement. And so you always had one or two people on staff that had those good connections with FBI or Secret Service, what have you, and that often helped considerably when you're doing investigations. Now, you can't simply rely on that. And I think it's almost more important now, and you tell me, to be training new people into financial institutions about the investigative side of anti-money laundering, even if they're not investigators. So somebody in compliance, maybe not a business line, but an analyst, having that. And a lot of what you do is that sort of training to give people some ideas regarding investigations. But does that make sense, or do you want to still keep it in the bucket where investigators investigate and compliance do compliance?
No, I like where you're going with that, John. To me, I think it's critically important to have that type of training. I think it's critically important to get more engaged with different aspects and different groups in the financial institutions. Going back to my days in law enforcement, we didn't view the bank from the standpoint of different buckets or silos. We viewed the bank as one bank, and when I issued a subpoena or served a subpoena on a bank, the expectation was that we served it to the right people.
Sometimes that was a mistake, right? Because
absolutely,
that wasn't the case, right?
No. In fact, that's what we're seeing today more and more. That's what I understand today now that I'm working with the banks, is to realize, and that's what bankers tell me all the time, if the law enforcement people knew to go to the right person, if they came to me, if I was the compliance officer, instead of their friend who was a former law enforcement officer who might be in the fraud section or doing fraud investigations, we would have been able to get that information for you that much quicker. So I think the ability to work across programs and different functions in the banks and have different contacts in different aspects of the bank is so critically important, because you'll get to where you need to get the right records a lot sooner, and with less impediments along the way, and you'll see that maybe the bank is being cooperative when you thought maybe they were resisting, and it's a matter that you didn't know to go to the right place in the bank to get the best service, and so that's important. And what I also see when I deal with compliance professionals is I've had the great fortune now in the last few years working with compliance to see how dedicated people on the compliance side are, and how much they want to help law enforcement, and how much in certain ways they don't know how to do that, or they don't know where to go, and that's where some of the training comes in. But I've embraced the recommendations from bankers, and I encourage law enforcement to do that they can get a lot of good help and a lot of good guidance from people who are in the compliance function as to what to ask for, how to ask for it, and where to ask for it.
Let's go off a little bit on outreach. As we mentioned, there's pretty formal outreach, which is presentations and programs like what we're contemplating, but also what I found from my years working with the banks before I came to ACAMS is that a number of institutions on their own put together, I don't say committees, but put together meetings several times a year with local law enforcement. DEA would come to those meetings, IRS, Criminal Division, your former colleagues at the FBI, and maybe 3 or 4 times a year in a particular state or region, they would come and over lunch, perhaps, just share, not war stories, but cases, closed cases, or at least examples from cases that have been, maybe some information is filtered out so that you can share that information, just so the banks got a sense of what was happening in those regions and what to look out for. And then on the other side of that, that bankers would also be able to share with other bankers similar things. Not so much SARs that they filed, but investigations that they've started. What came, not so much what came of the case, but what led them to filing, what led them to reporting, what were the key things, and did they make a policy change? So talk about that part of this, the outreach, formal conferences, webinars, we get all that, but how can institutions and law enforcement get together throughout the year? What's valuable?
Well, I think what's valuable there is kind of at the grassroots level in the different cities and jurisdictions that banks are in, and with their local law enforcement, both at the local level and the federal level, is to participate in those grassroots working groups. Like we met with Jim Cox today again, and Jim is a driving force behind a group in Northern Virginia called SAFI, and those types of groups are all over the country, where you have working groups between banks and law enforcement. To me, at the local levels, at the grassroots levels, those are invaluable, because you get a better sense of from the banker to law enforcement, what law enforcement is interested in, how they would prefer the SARs to be written, what they need to make their cases. And going back in the other direction, I think it's valuable to the bankers to hear those case studies as to, just how their institutions were victimized, and to go back at their levels, at the grassroots levels, and kind of build it back up to the headquarters or national level as to what the crime problems are. I think you need to attack it from both directions. You need to have a national strategy, the national outreach, attending the national forums and conferences. I think that's really important to get kind of an industry-wide perspective. But then at the local grassroots level, I always tell people, when especially on the subject of SARs, people ask, it's such a subjective thing, and writing a SAR can be very subjective. People would ask me as a law enforcement agent, what do I want to see, or how should we write it? And my first recommendation is get to the SAR working group. Every U.S. Attorney's office now, and I think there are 90 some odd U.S. Attorney's offices in the United States, has a SAR work group. And it's important to get to that SAR work group to find out, how do you write the SARs in that venue. And likewise, the different grassroots working groups that get together either on a monthly or quarterly basis to share information. Those information exchanges are tremendous, and it builds up that relationships between the banks, the bankers, the investigators. They get personal relationships that are built up, and it's easier to pick up the phone and call somebody and to initiate the contacts and the information sharing that way.
Yeah, we're gonna tie this up, and in the future podcasts, I'd like to talk more about some of the challenges of new products, new areas of concern, global issues. But I think closing out today's theme, even though we're in a high-tech world, nothing beats personal relationships.
No, absolutely not. No, personal relationships are so critically important. It's great to have the technology, and the technology helps facilitate investigations and the compliance function, but at the end of the day, there's a human factor, and you have to have a successful human element here, and the importance of those relationships where you can share information, where you can communicate with each other, where you can cooperate and share that information is invaluable. There's nothing better than that.
So I think what we've learned today, obviously, whether it's local, state, or federal level, and certainly you could argue global, I suppose, that's a little bit different, a little more challenging, but the extent that institutional representatives can share peer-to-peer, to the extent that law enforcement and the financial sector can share across lines, if you will, although obviously we'd like to think of ourselves on the same side, there's no substitute for that. And so to the extent that we've done anything at ACAMS, I hope that we've offered umbrella protection, if you will, for that information sharing, and that's a constant. So I'd like to think that going forward, we're only going to be able to improve that. So we'll talk again, Dennis, but I really do appreciate you taking the time today. And if people want to find out more about your company, give them your website.
Yeah, it's excuse me, www.dmlassociatesllc.com. And I would like to say, John, I'd like to congratulate and commend ACAMS for the outreach that you guys have had, the working groups that you've put together, especially the one between Homeland Security and ACAMS and certain ACAMS members regarding the human smuggling issue as a model for success. And that's kind of the theme that we've talked about here today. Those types of relationships and those types of working groups are what really make a difference, and look at the successes they've had. So congratulations to ACAMS for being out in front on this issue.
Thanks a lot, man, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks.
Good.
So there you have it, folks. That's our first podcast with Dennis Larmel. Dennis has an interesting perspective, and one that's so important to the membership. And we're going to come back to him at some point in a future podcast. So this is our first one. Let us know what you think. Let us know who you'd like to see me interview, and we'll see you down the road. Take care.